Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy and a co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School. I'm excited for our discussion today regarding the 70th edition of BP's Statistical Review of World Energy, which BP released last week. We've been really lucky for the last several years to host BP's chief economist, Spencer Dale, to discuss the headline findings of the report and what they mean for the global energy system. And I'm going to hand it over to Spencer to walk us through the key findings in just a moment. It's always interesting to hear Spencer's take on what's happened in the prior year, and that of all of our panelists for this event, but especially, I think, after 2020, which of course was an extraordinary year in so many ways for the world energy system, and in many other respects, of course, as well. The COVID pandemic has acted as a stress test on the energy sector, unlike any we've seen since perhaps World War II, and its effects are clearly evident in the statistics that we are going to explore today. The impacts of the pandemic on our energy system will be with us for years, and this report is perhaps the most thorough look yet at exactly how the energy system responded to this once in more than a generation event. At the same time as our society has struggled to cope with the pandemic, we have, with increasing urgency, tried to forge ahead in efforts to address the climate challenge and reduce energy-related emissions. And we're getting a clearer idea of what a pathway to net zero might look like, including, as we'll hear, I suspect, in a little bit from our colleague at the International Energy Agency, because of the landmark report that they put out recently. And of course, in November, world leaders will gather in Glasgow, seeking to get us on that pathway, elevate ambition, and we need those ambitions to be met with concrete actions as well. So we'll take a look also today at how the energy transition is faring and what it will take to get us on that pathway to net zero. The BP Statistical Review of Energy, again, for 70 years, has provided a really comprehensive analysis of the year past in global energy in all of its breadth and complexity. Really delighted, Spencer, to have you with us today to talk about that. Spencer Dale has been the chief economist of BP since 2014. In this role, he's responsible for advising the board and the executive team on economic drivers and trends in all aspects of global energy. Prior to joining BP, he was the chief economist at the Bank of England, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee there, and really I can think of no one better to help make sense of this year's report than Spencer. And then we'll hear from him to provide an overview, and then we'll really be joined by an all-star panel of three tremendous experts to help share their thoughts and some color and some commentary on the year past. Laura Cozzi, James Glynn, and Meghan O'Sullivan. Laura is the chief energy modeler at the International Energy Agency. She took the lead with one of her colleagues in its recent flagship publication, producing the IEA's first ever scenario modeling what net zero 2050 looks like. Dr. James Glynn is one of our newest research scholars here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, who focuses on energy systems modeling, has over 15 years of experience with energy systems analysis and energy technology research, development, and deployment. And Dr. Meghan O'Sullivan, someone I'm lucky to call a friend and a research collaborator, is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of the Geopolitics of Energy program at Harvard's Kennedy School. She was a former top national security official in the administration of George W. Bush. After a discussion with our panelists, we'll then take questions from the audience. For those of us joining via Zoom, you can submit a question to our panelists at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, this event is being broadcast live, and a recording of it will be available on our website in the coming days. Thank you all again for joining us for this event. Really delighted to have you with us, Spencer Dale, and let me turn it over to you.
Hey, Jason, good to speak to you again. I wish I could be there in person, hopefully next time. And thank you to the panelists for sparing the time today. That's an amazing set of discussants. So I'm going to be trying to be very quick, make sure we have time for a discussion. So I always think the hardest thing when you do these things is sharing your screen. So let's see if I can navigate that, then that will be the hard bit done. I think that's worked. Okay, so as you were saying, Jason, in normal years, the BP Statistical Review gives you a really nice opportunity to just stand back from all the high frequency noise and data coming in each day as we live through a year, and just gives you an opportunity to just stand back and give you a sense about what went on in the previous year. And that's true for normal years. But as you were saying, last year was anything but normal. So it's even more useful to sort of get a sense of what happened last year and what it might mean for the future. And when I was approaching this year's stats review, that was pretty much all my aim was. We didn't really want to do lots of clever, detailed analysis. Just telling the story of what happened so everybody can sort of get their arms around it was just sort of what we had, what was the objective going into this. And as you mentioned, this is the 70th anniversary of BP's stats review, which is quite an amazing thing in itself. So we've been publishing this document since 1952. And if you think back over those last 70 years, there's been a pretty amazing events in global energy. You know, the Suez Canal crisis in the 1950s, the two oil shocks in the 1970s, more recently the Fukushima tragedy. So all of these events had huge bearing on global energy systems, but all pale into insignificance compared to the events of last year. The headline numbers from last year are very dramatic. Global energy demand, shown here on the left, we estimate fell by around 4.5% last year as the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown spilled over into global energy. And as you can see from this chart, you need to go back to 1945 to see a larger fall in global energy demand. And likewise, in terms of carbon emissions from energy use, shown here on the chart on the right, they fell by over 6%. Again, you need to go back to World War II to see a larger fall in carbon emissions, and that took the level of carbon emissions back to levels last seen in 2011. This next chart sort of summarizes the movements in the main components of energy demand, just to give you a sense of what drove that in terms of the different fuels and different sources of demand. What drove this 4.5% fall in global energy demand? And you can see the big outlier here, or the big driver here, is oil. Oil demand fell by over 9 million barrels a day on average last year. That accounted for around 3/4 of the total fall, of the fall in total energy demand. So when you're thinking about last year, this is a story driven by very large falls and disproportionately large falls in oil demand. Natural gas was far more resilient and fell by around 2%, which if you go back, is pretty similar to the falls we saw in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. What's interesting, the size of the economic recession last year was more than double the size of what we saw in 2009. But despite that far bigger drop in economic activity, the fall in natural gas was pretty similar. So resilience from natural gas. And the smallest fall was in the consumption of electricity, which we estimate was around 1% last year. These orange bars show you the numbers for the global changes last year. The green bars, just by way of comparison, build in the numbers for the US, just to give you a sense about what's happening in terms of closer to home in terms of the US markets. And a couple of points I think are worth pulling out here. First, the fall in US energy demand was quite a bit bigger. So total US energy demand fell by around 7.7% compared to the global average of 4.5%. And what's interesting here, this is despite the fact that the fall in US GDP was pretty much in line with the global average. So US GDP is estimated to have fallen in the region of 3.5% last year. That's pretty much bang in line with the fall in global GDP. So despite a similar size fall in economic activity, the fall in US energy demand around 65–70% bigger. Some of that, I think, reflects the relative oil intensity of the US economy. The US is quite a bit more oil intensive, and this was an oil dominated shock. And so some of it stems from there. What's really eye-catching in this chart is a huge falls in US coal consumption last year, approaching 20%. But I think that's largely a sort of a fuel mix story rather than the fall in absolute demand. So this was essentially a story of coal losing out relative to natural gas and renewables within the power sector, rather than a story of helping to explain why US primary demand fell by so much. What is striking is that US power demand or electricity consumption fell by around 3 times more than the global average. And so in terms of arithmetically, that's another important factor helping to account for why we saw a sort of outsized fall in US energy consumption. I'm not sure I have a good explanation in terms of exactly why the US power demand fell by so much more than the global average, but I'd be more than happy to hear others' views on that. If we look at the oil market, which was the epicenter of this shock, as you can see, oil demand, as I mentioned, fell by over 9 million barrels a day. That in percentage terms, that's about close to 9.5%. And you can see from this chart, that's far larger than anything we've ever seen in history. Even if you go back to the end of the World War II, shown in this chart here, you don't see anything approaching this size of fall in oil demand. And I don't think there's any great puzzle here. I mean, for any of us who lived through extended lockdowns, which I know you certainly did in the US and we did here in Europe, the lockdowns detracted from oil demand in a completely different way to a normal recession, essentially crushing transport-related oil demand. People stopped flying, many people stopped driving, and oil demand collapsed. And that is the essence of that fall in oil demand, and that's the essence accounts for a big fall in total energy demand last year. In terms of the supply side, as you know, after an initial disagreement, OPEC cut oil production very substantially, cutting by over 9.5 million barrels a day starting from May of last year, and that helped to stabilize the markets. But as shown in this next chart, you also saw a really substantial fall in US tight oil, falling by around 2 million barrels a day in a course of 3 or 4 months in the spring of last year. And typically, we always think of US tight oil being highly responsive relative to other types of oil, but that responsiveness of tight oil is normally framed in terms of the relatively high decline rates you see in tight oil basins, combined with the ability to halt new investment relatively quickly. The pace of decline we saw last year was far quicker than that, and it was based rather than on steep decline rates. It was driven by a shutting in of producing wells, reflecting a mixture of both economics as prices fell very sharply, and also logistics as there was just an ability or inability for some tight oil production to actually reach storage facilities sufficiently quickly and adequately. So a very sharp fall we saw there in US tight oil. At the other end of the spectrum was renewable energy, led by wind and solar power. So the charts here show you increases in installed capacity in wind and solar on the left and right hand side here. And you can see, despite all this turmoil, and remember, these are projects which are getting up and completed. So despite the fact that they was highly constrained by the impact of COVID, and despite the collapse in GDP, that installed capacity grew by a colossal 238 gigawatts in 2020, which is more than 50% more than any time seen in history. So the increase in installed capacity of wind and solar last year, 50% greater than any time seen in history, despite that turmoil and despite the collapse in GDP. And as you can, the bars here sort of split up the contributions from China in blue and the rest of the world in orange. And you can see there's a huge contribution here from China, which accounted for around for over half of the increase in installed wind and solar capacity. The number for Chinese onshore wind capacity, shown here on the left-hand side, is particularly striking. You can see it's huge compared to anything seen in the past. Some of that stems from changes in subsidy packages, which brought forward some projects which would normally have been registered for this year, and it brought them forward into 2020. But even if you take account of that, it seems clear that 2020 was a record year for increases in installed capacity of wind and solar power. And that then fed through into record increases in renewable power generation. The increase in the share of renewables in total power generation, shown here by the orange line in the right-hand side, recorded its largest ever increase. So largest ever increase in the share of renewables in total power generation. And that increasing share of renewables in total power generation came largely at the expense of coal, shown by the black line here is declining, which recorded one of its largest ever falls. And I think this is a sort of source of optimism here, that this trend of strong growth in renewables crowding out coal is exactly what the world needs to see as it transitions to net zero. So in that sense, an encouraging sign. One point I wanted to make on this fall in carbon emissions. So as I said, carbon emissions from energy use fell by over 6% last year. From a historical perspective, that's the largest fall we've seen for 75 years. But from a forward-looking perspective, that's a sort of rate of decline we need to see on average each and every year for the next 30 years. So if you compound up a fall of a little over 6% for the next 30 years, that equates to a reduction in carbon emissions of around 85% by 2050. So sort of broadly in line with a well below 2 degree scenario, but not sufficiently quick necessarily to hit a 1.5 degree scenario. This chart decomposes the fall in carbon emissions into the two components driving that, the fall in primary energy, shown here in purple, and the fall in the carbon intensity of the energy mix, shown here in orange. Both of those are directly related to the fall in oil demand. And so there's a good chance that as the virus is brought under control and lockdowns are eased, those falls will be reversed. And indeed, in some of the work that Laura and her colleagues at the IEA have produced, they estimated that carbon emissions by the end of last year were already above pre-COVID levels. So it looks like much of that that fall in carbon emissions may have been reversed. Moreover, the fall in carbon emissions was driven by a huge collapse in GDP. So if you just do a simple sum where you equate the fall in carbon emissions with the fall in GDP, that equates to an implied carbon price of around $1,400 per ton. So a scarily high number, $1,400 per ton. So the challenge I think facing us is we need to produce similar size falls as last year, but we need to do them in such a way that they're on a sustained basis. And we also need to do them in such a way that we can do it without causing huge damage to everyday lives and livelihoods. And there is some encouraging signs that the collective jolt and huge costs of COVID that we experienced with COVID last year has led to an increased determination to take more dramatic or more decisive action to prevent an even more costly trauma in the form of climate change. You can see that on the left-hand side at a country level with around 70% of carbon emissions now covered by net zero pledges of one form or another. And there's been a similar huge explosion of companies like BP who are committed to getting to net zero. So encouraging signs in terms of rising ambition, prompted and supported by rising societal expectations. But it's not yet clear that this is being translated into decisive changes. Now, this chart was taken from the IEA's World Energy Outlook, their WEO, which was published in November 2015. So I picked November 2015 because that was just prior to the Paris COP, so just prior to the UN climate conference in Paris. And at the time that the IEA published their WEO, they published 3 scenarios. Their current policy scenario, which implied that policies remained as they were, shown here in red. The green new policy scenario, which is based on policies, an implementation of policies which had been announced at that point. And the purple so-called 450 scenario, which was consistent with a set of policies which gave a better than 50% chance of maintaining temperature rises below 2 degrees. So if we then build in what actually happened to carbon emissions since the Paris COP, you can see up to 2019, carbon emissions have pretty much carried on in their relentless rise, pretty much in line with the policies which had been announced prior to the Paris COP, and really very little sign whatsoever of any sort of decisive break as envisaged by the purple 2-degree scenario. If I build in last year's numbers, that takes the carbon emissions far closer to the purple 2-degree scenario. But as I just said, I think much of those carbon emissions are likely to be reversed this year. And so we're likely to go back up towards a trend path we were closer on before last year. So encouraging trends, Jason, in terms of hopes and ambitions, but they are not yet being translated into tangible, concrete differences. And I think perhaps what last year's numbers showed us for carbon emissions was just the sort of the nature and the scale of that challenge. I think I pretty much exhausted my time, so let me stop there and hand it back to you, Jason.
Spencer, thanks so much. Really rich conversation. I'll ask the panelists to turn their screens on and come into the conversation now, and we'll have a discussion about that. I have lots of questions about what you just showed and what the implications might be, but let me start just a bit broad, if I could. I'd be curious, maybe we'll go Laura and then James and then Meghan to hear general reactions. What did you find most surprising, if anything, in that data you just saw? What do you think is most consequential for understanding the year that just went past, and also what, if anything, it tells us about where we're going from here, including for purposes of trying to close the gap between ambition and reality in the energy transition, as Spencer just alluded to. Laura, let me start with you for your comments and reactions. And of course, as I said in the introduction, you've spent a lot of time thinking not just about where we are today, but where we need to be in 2050 recently. So look forward to hearing your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Spencer, for the presentation. I first of all would like to start saying that the results that the data that Spencer just showed are very much aligned with our own global energy review, so that we published last year. And I would like to maybe articulate my thoughts in three separate points. First, a lot of discussion last year was about similarities and differences compared to the global financial crisis and the impact of that on the energy sector. So I would start with that. The second point is reflecting upon this year. So how the trends of last year are actually impacting the trends of this year, and then more a bit about the longer term. So on the first point, differences compared to the global financial crisis. So we clearly had a hit for demand that was huge, much larger than it was in the global financial crisis. So 6-7 times larger in terms of energy contraction. This is really huge, really huge. However, there is one country that behaved very different compared to anyone else. So everyone contracted but China. And I think this is worth actually highlighting. So we have a world that went into a very clear direction, but China took a different direction. It took a different direction in terms of economic growth and took a different direction in terms of energy growth. And I think what Spencer showed in terms of what they did in terms of renewables is extraordinary. So China added 75 gigawatts of wind. Their average was around 30 for the past several years. So an incredible deployment of renewables, but it was not the only growth area. All other fuels grew as well. So we have this huge decline in CO2 emissions despite actually China growing. So I think this is a very important point, very different from the global financial crisis, and an anomaly, a difference compared to the rest of the world. Another, let's call it anomaly, or call it another way in a more positive terms, is resilience. Clearly, renewables showed a great deal of resilience. China was leading the way. But if you look country by country, renewables grew everywhere. It's not the only part of the clean energy transition that was really resilient. If you look at electric vehicles, they reached record high as well. So we have here a part of the story that shows some quite big resilience of through a major economic shock of the clean energy sector, seen in many cases as a safer bet than other investment. Now, when we looked in detail what was happening month by month, our analysis was actually that basically the contraction in energy demand happened very clearly when we were in lockdowns. So if you were to show what happened through the months, April was when everything went down even 20% that specific year. And as Spencer said, our analysis for December is actually we were basically back on a global level to pre-crisis level, including on emissions. So we asked ourselves another question, which is how much of this shock was structural and how much of this shock is cyclical. So it's once we are out of our confinement, once we restart our lives. So what we see is very clearly electricity demand starts skyrocketing again, following previous path. On oil, for what concerns private transport, taking our cars, going back to office, very similar trends. So we had cities, despite a lot of efforts on new lanes in bicycles, etc. When you look at the number for cities, we are back to pre-crisis level very quickly. The aviation sector is a bit more of a question mark. So of the 2.5 gigaton of emission reduction that we had last year, our assessment is that around a quarter is actually structural, but all the rest is cyclical. So will immediately bounce back. Now, on the structural part, is exactly what Spencer showed on the power sector. And we are really seeing a systematic replacement of electricity generation from renewables, growing shares and eating up shares out of coal. Now, is it taken in the pocket and taken for granted? This is happening at global level and we are safe? Not so clear. Our assessment for 2021 points to a bit of two different speeds of transition. Emerging economies very clearly moving ahead. Advanced economies very clearly moving ahead with an acceleration of more renewables, more EVs, far less so in the emerging worlds. If you take China apart, the emerging worlds was hit very, very severely by this crisis. Electricity demand is skyrocketing back up. Investments are not going as quickly as we may wish for this year. So our expectation is actually emissions will rebound very, very strongly this year to basically eat up everything that we have saved last year. I'll conclude here with two expectations. On one, what we are assessing in terms of recovery plans, these may actually, once they trigger into the economy and materialize in terms of new investments, we may actually start seeing a bit of a difference in 1 to 3 years times once those are into our economies. Again, in 10 days of times, we will show our assessment of this. I maybe can anticipate that, again, that is a very much a story of two speeds. We are seeing advanced economies very much pushing on sustainable recoveries, emerging countries not so much. The final point here is about the NDCs. We are seeing a big raise in ambition. So again, the outlook for the next year may be and certainly will be of this year a rebound. For me, the key question remains open about what we will see in 2025, 2030, as if we put forward the increase in ambition that we're seeing in some of the NDCs, this may actually change the outlook for several fuels, including fossil fuels. Thank you.
Laura, thanks so much. That was a great overview. Just a quick follow-up. So I'm curious kind of where you land in terms of optimism, pessimism, if those are the right words for how one thinks about the transition. You noted a few different trends that point in different directions, how resilient renewables and electric vehicles are. at the same time how quickly energy use and therefore emissions are going to bounce back, that this was not fundamental structural change. It was what happens when you shut down much of the global economy. So I'm just kind of curious, after seeing this, as Spencer called it, this mother of all stress tests on the energy system, you know, what your kind of bottom line is on how you think about the outlook.
So I'll give the appointment for the outlook of this year, which is 13th of October this year. We're coming out a bit early, so I anticipate that we are very much thinking about it in the outlook, and Jason knows that very well. I would say that it's a bit mixed signals for the time being. So I think the electricity sector is seeing a lot of the good stuff happening, a lot of new investments in renewables, a lot of new investment in solar and wind, and an increasing awareness of the flexibility needs. For everything else, which I think we can remind everyone is 80% still of energy use, not so much happening. So this is where we are still sitting.
Thanks. A lot more work to do. James, let me turn to you. Same sort of open-ended question about what you found most interesting, surprising, maybe not surprising, and consequential, both to understand this mother of all stress tests and what you found most interesting about it, and what, if anything, it tells us about where we might be headed from here.
Great, thanks, Jason. Spencer, thank you very much for your presentation, and also thanks to BP for continuing to provide this data, the World Statistical Review. You know, it's open and it's free. BP have been doing this long before open data and open science was a concept. So, you know, knowing that the energy system is the energy of the global economy, this reliable open data set is extremely useful for me as a quantitative systems modeler. It's really useful every year to get an early helicopter view on what's changing. So I've two key points I want to look at, two key numbers. There are many useful, interesting numbers in this year's review. You highlighted the two of them. The headline numbers showing energy demand dropping by 4.5%, global energy-related carbon emissions dropping by 6.3% are, of course, really dramatic. I'm really interested to know the unexpected systematic effects which drove these CO2 emission declines so dramatically. So I'm an energy systems modeler. Typically, when we're modeling these energy system scenarios for the energy transition, the low-hanging fruit in terms of CO2 reductions at least cost comes first. You know, first comes the power sector, next comes buildings and services sectors, and then typically transport and industry are considered the harder and costlier sectors to abate. COVID-19, the pandemic, flipped this kind of decarbonization merit order on its head. As you said, Spencer, oil demand, transport demand was the main impact from COVID. So by temporarily locking down the private sector and longer term restrictions on international aviation, transport demand plummeted, and even with the similar vehicle stock as 2019, the overall emissions intensity of the system dropped by 1.8%, which is huge. The emissions intensity improvements, if you wanted to look at them that way, show higher relative carbon intensity of the transport sector compared to power building sectors that did not lose as much energy demand in 2020. No one would want to improve energy efficiency or carbon intensity of the transport sector with this continued demand destruction. However, the data in this year's review really shows the scale of the opportunity and the scale of the challenge in future decarbonisation of the transport sector and how not to do it. The other interesting set of numbers, as you touched on, Spencer, are the installed capacities of renewable energy technologies in the power sector. I believe this is the first time that BP has included these installed capacity numbers, and I really welcome this. It's really useful, again, as a quantitative modeler. The near doubling of wind new capacity additions between 2019 and 2020 is dramatic and huge, and thankfully a positive number from a really stark year. However, again, as an energy systems modeler as a whole, we continue collectively as a community to underestimate the learning rates and cost improvements from low complexity technologies such as wind and solar. So Spencer, a question to throw back at you. I really wonder what you consider what you called the faster learning within energy technology cost reductions of solar and wind capacity additions. This is all coming from China. And so is it perhaps continued research and development spending and incentives in China that we're not typically considering in our energy systems modeling and our scenario pathways? I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on that. Thanks, Jason. I'll leave my remarks there for now.
Excellent. Thanks. Really interesting. I appreciate it. Meghan, let me turn to you to wrap up some opening reactions. Again, kind of what you found consequential or surprising about it. And hopefully, among other things you might touch on, you'll touch on what you and I have been spending a lot of time thinking about lately, which is how to think about the geopolitical implications of an energy transition. I thought it was interesting that there were clearly, and I hope you'll comment on what some of the implications were for relations between countries. We obviously saw this historic producer and consumer coming together to deal with the downturn in oil markets, but in many other respects as well. So there's this real shock to the system, not just for climate, for energy, but geopolitically. And then as Spencer said, if we're going to see a transition, we need to see this happening every single year from now on, which may mean there are pretty significant foreign policy considerations to take into account.
Great. Yes, I'll try to touch on some of those things, but as you said to Spencer, this report elicits so many different issues that I'll look forward to the rest of the conversation as well. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel today, and I want to echo all the thanks that people gave to Spencer and BP for the annual report, which again is so key to people doing research and making policy in this arena. And of course, this is not a political report, but given this close relationship between geopolitics and energy, a treasure trove of statistics on energy really tells us a lot about geopolitics, or raises a lot of important questions. So like others, I'll be brief just in giving you a few opening comments and perspectives, and look forward to the conversation to delve more deeply into things. I would say, looking at it from a geopolitical perspective, kind of three things jumped out at me. And two of these, I think, have been mentioned explicitly, and the third I'll spend more time on. The first is just that this report underscores the enormity of the challenge of the energy transition. The 6.2% fall in global carbon emissions that Spencer laid out and the report lays out, I think speaks for itself, given that seems like a pretty paltry number given the dramatic decrease in global economic activity at the time. So that and the implied carbon price that Spencer just mentioned of $1,400, it's really daunting. And so I think on the one hand, while people celebrate the decrease in emissions, I think the bigger picture is really underscoring the challenge of the transition. The second one is something that was already touched on by Laura, and this just has to do with the two speeds of the transition. And what struck me looking at the report was really this as it relates to coal. And this has come up a couple of times already in this discussion, that coal, I think when we look at the US numbers and even the slide on the United States that Spencer showed, we're seeing, as he said, exactly what we want to see. We see renewables growing robustly and replacing coal. But the global picture, of course, is actually a lot less celebratory. In fact, it's very sobering that even with renewables growing as greatly as they have, even within China, that actually the coal picture is still pretty robust, that renewables are not growing even enough to meet the increased demand, but that they're certainly not growing enough to meet the increased demand and displace coal. So I think, the fact that you have coal generation in 2020 being the same amount at an absolute level as it was in 2015 really suggests that even if renewables grow as robustly as we saw in 2020, that renewables are not going to be sufficient to really complete the energy transition. I think we all know that, but I think it was really underscored by some of the information provided by the new BP report. The last of the things I would mention, this really gets to your question, Jason, about the geopolitics of it all. So I think, we're all well aware that in order for the world to see a successful energy transition, we're going to need a lot of international cooperation, a lot of collaboration. And there's a few reasons for that we're well aware of. One is we're really going to need that collaboration to develop and bring new technologies to scale. If we look at the IEA report, which I'm hesitant to say much about with Laura here, but it said to me that we still have, well, it said pretty explicitly, we have the technologies we need to bring about the transition, to bring it on path to 2030, but going beyond 2030, we really need new technologies, and we need to bring technologies to scale and make them commercial. And that, in my mind, will certainly require international collaboration and cooperation, that if there is this move in the opposite direction, we're not going to see the kind of cooperation that lends itself to that level of innovation. Secondly, I think just going back to what I said about coal, we're going to need international collaboration if we're going to tackle some of the biggest challenges of the energy transition. And the report and discusses this a little bit in detail, but we can't ask the developing world, this kind of the part of the world that's moving at a different speed on the energy transition. We can't just say, the coal problem is yours, that you need to address the coal problem when the United States per capita, the people there are consuming more than 10 times the amount of energy that people in India are consuming. So this has to be a problem that is approached jointly, or the solution needs to be a joint solution. So obviously more international collaboration is needed to tackle these tough challenges. And then finally, we need the collaboration to have the right incentives for countries to act together. Of course, it's a collective action problem, as we know. So the question is, looking at this last year and looking at COVID, looking at the pandemic, should we feel optimistic about the international community's ability to work together to drive an energy transition? And I think, I admire the optimism that Spencer laid out in pointing out that, yes, we've seen companies really step up to the plate. We've seen a number of countries make pledges for these net zero commitments by 2050 in most cases. However, if we look at the last year, I think the record is not good. I mean, it's clear that the world really failed in coming together and providing a coordinated response to the pandemic, at least in the initial phases, assuming, or really most of the phase, assuming that we're towards the end. I say initial phase, that's another signal of pessimism. But I would say, we really didn't see the international leadership we needed there. If we think about what's going to happen in the future, we're not seeing, I think Gordon Brown said, we're seeing a moral failure of the world in vaccinating the world equitably. So if we look at these two places where we really needed to see global leadership, either the G7, the G20, or some other form of leadership, we didn't see it with the pandemic. Now, I think it's very possible that the pandemic has increased people's sensitivity to climate change. I think people do see it somewhat as a dress rehearsal for climate change, and it's a dress rehearsal that went really badly. So potentially it will galvanize the world to act more collaboratively. But again, the most important collaborative relationship for the energy transition is the US-China relationship. And certainly the last year was anything but good for the US-China relationship. Not only did the pandemic create new strains, but there's a host of other factors we could talk about. So I'll end simply by saying, that I apologize for the note of pessimism, but I think when we look at this geopolitically, the last year really underscores the need for extraordinary international collaboration to meet the goals of the energy transition. And the last year suggests that the world has not demonstrated, even in the face of a truly global, an acute global threat, the ability to come together. And I, again, hope that was a bad dress rehearsal, but I think we need to stare that in the face and think about what some of the consequences of that might be.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Really, really interesting. And I have a couple of follow-up questions, but Spencer, you heard a lot there. So just before I jump into some particular questions, just wanted to see if you wanted to come back to any of the comments you just heard and had any reactions to them.
Yes. So thank you to all three discussers there. Fantastic. Let me just make 3 points, I guess. One was on this coal renewables thing, which Meghan and Laura picked up. So yes, encouraging that renewables crowding out coal, but as Meghan highlighted, although renewable power has more than doubled over the last 5 years, although renewables accounted for 60% of the growth in power generation, the level of coal generation in 2020 pretty much unchanged from this level in 2015. Rapid growth in renewables is not sufficient to crowd out coal, and I think that's it's an important point. And one data point I just hadn't really spotted until I was looking at the Stats Review data more recently, actually, was I think a number of us a few years ago had been pretty confident that we thought coal consumption in China had peaked. Last year was the third consecutive year in which coal consumption grew. And if it grew by the same amount next year as it did this year as it did last year, it will exceed its 2014 peak. So the idea of China's coal consumption peaking now no longer looks as assured as it did before. In response to James, in terms of why does collectively, I mean, BP, and we were very clear in the report in terms of, but others sort of keep underestimating the growth of renewable energy, and likewise the pace at which costs fall. And James alludes to some analysis that we talk about in the report about working out, is that because we're learning faster, for a given build out of our costs falling by more, or is there just more learning because the build out is greater? And it looks like the lion's share is coming from fast learning, and James said sort of why. One thing, James, which I hadn't really fully understood, but we're doing some modeling on, is one thing which seems to be a real important driver is the scale of the individual plants. So as the scale of wind farms grow and the scale of solar farms grow, that seems to be a really big driver in terms of reducing costs per megawatt or cost per gigawatt. And so that's one thing I think one doesn't normally, and it's obvious, there's just economies of scale. You only need one road in, but if the solar farm is that much bigger, then you reduce the cost. And so that's sort of something which we hadn't, I'm not sure I fully understood until we looked into it more. But then raises the question is, at what point do you peak here, particularly for onshore solar? There's a limit to how, if you can just keep on making bigger and bigger and bigger solar farms. And finally, this is a slightly controversial point, but I'll just raise it as a sort of question, I guess, and it gets to Meghan's point about the sort of the geopolitics of all this and the need for a joint solution. I guess, put very simply, I guess, is we're all trying to solve a global problem with huge externalities, and the method of choice is for countries to have country targets. We're all obsessed about how many net zero targets of each country going to do. It's a sort of slightly odd that we're solving this global problem with a framework focused around individual countries doing their sort of looking at their own country emissions. And one implication of that is there's a huge need to get funding from the developed world to the developing world. That's what, in a business as usual scenario, all of the growth in carbon emissions, all of the growth in energy comes from the developing world. But if the developed world just focus on hitting their own net zero targets, there's a real danger that we don't actually, we miss the wood for the trees here, question mark.
Thanks, Spencer. Yeah, no, really interesting. I was going to come to that in the course of the questions, because the IEA Net Zero 2050 report attracted so much attention, and want to make sure people didn't miss lots of other important reports the IEA has put out recently. One of them was on how to drive more investment into clean energy in emerging markets and developing economies, which, as you said, is where the emissions growth is going to come from. And the focus on how much will you promise to cut emissions by 2030 is one thing in the US or Europe. It's different in parts of the world that don't really have many emissions to cut yet because they haven't started growing yet and using more energy. And interested, I want to come to that I want to come to that in a minute. I'm going to work in some other questions that we're getting from the audience and stuff as I go, but just to make sure people understand. And by the way, I should say, the less I talk, the more interesting this will be. So don't rely on me to ask questions. If you want to jump in on something, ask questions of one another, get a dialogue and discussion going, please do, don't be shy. The reason renewables grew rather robustly while coal, oil, and gas overall declined. Just make sure everyone watching sort of understands that, Spencer, is this policy driven? It's just the nature of the cost now, the dispatch order. Help people understand why, and how much of that was the result of planned investments in renewables from years before the pandemic that were just playing out last year.
Yeah, yes, and I think that's when we do this, when I think about the modeling of these different types of energy, I think of essentially, particularly wind and solar, as being relatively unrelated to the economic cycle or the high frequency economic cycle. So essentially, this is long-term planning, in some countries supported by various forms of support and subsidies. In increasingly other parts of the world, this long-term planning happens without the need for heavy support. But once those projects are up and running, the low cost of dispatch means they carry on being dispatched. And so what happens is, as economic growth slows, or if you have a recession and the demand for energy falls, that reduces, and total energy has to fall. And the thing that gives is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is a marginal source of fuels, if you like. It's a marginal source of energy. And when you see very strong growth, you see fossil fuels growing disproportionately strongly because they get sucked in and then they get sucked back out again. So that's why, in some sense, you get this pattern in carbon intensity, that the carbon intensity tends to improve during downturns because the thing that's giving up are hydrocarbons. So what we saw, I think, last year was, to a large extent, a continuation of that planning. As I mentioned, I think some of the extreme numbers we saw in China for wind are related to changes in subsidy policies and accounting policies, which ended up both putting forward some projects which would have been registered for this year. They ended up being registered for 2020, and there were some projects which hadn't yet been registered from previous years, also sort of pulled into 2020. So some of this was, in some sense, an accounting issue, but even controlling for that, it seems like we saw exceptionally strong growth. And I think some of that is because it's sort of unrelated to the cycle. But what's surprising here is that there was still huge the turmoil going on in terms of COVID, and people were locked down. People weren't able to go out and do the engineering and manufacturing processes that's required to generate this installed capacity. But despite that, it continued to go on. And I think part of that speaks to just the huge sort of strong sort of investor push there is in terms of getting these projects up and running at the moment. We saw a huge explosion in ESG funding and funding going into renewables, and I think that's also helps sort of support some of the momentum we've seen in renewables.
Yeah, and your numbers obviously showed 2020. Now we're halfway through 2021, and coal prices are quite strong. Demand's coming back quite robustly. I guess the IEA told us a few months ago that that's not surprising, although in the next couple of years, Laura, you would expect coal demand to kind of plateau. Anything you wanted, or James, you wanted to comment on about what this tells us about renewables moving forward, or coal, or I can move on if not, but. Okay. The last year was also, Spencer, the first time in a long time we saw an increase in the number of people without energy access. You make that point in the report. We saw a sharp decline in economic activity, and with that, a sharp decline in energy use and emissions, particularly when you look at emerging markets and developing economies. I mentioned the IEA report a minute ago. Parts of the world that need higher levels of prosperity and growth, but we also need emissions to fall really fast. Does the experience last year tell us something about how to rapidly decarbonize while also providing energy services to parts of the world with just a small fraction of the standard of living many of us and many watching sort of take for granted every day? I'd love to hear thoughts on that, Spencer, and anyone else.
Yeah, and let me say a few words, but then I should hand over to Laura, because the IEA are one of the key organizations that are collecting and compiling these data on energy access. So energy access, which is often framed in part of Sustainable Development Goal 7, SDG 7, which talks about ensuring sustainable, clean and modern energy access for all. A lot of that is framed around access to electricity. The good news is, if you look over a 4 or 5 year period, significant improvement has been made from sort of close to 1 billion people in 2015 to I think the most recent data I think that I can find is for 2019, which is 750 million. I think data that, or analysis that the IEA have produced together with the UN and the World Bank suggests that this year or last year, the impact of COVID could have reduced energy access or access to electricity by around 30 million people. And that's just essentially that it's not that they weren't, the wiring's not there, it's that they can't afford to consume it. The one other point I mentioned is sort of energy access as a concept is quite nebulous, and so the SDG 7 criteria is defined in terms of household consumption, and so it's access in terms of a bundle of household residential consumption. But obviously the amount of electricity you need to actually promote sustainable economic growth is a lot higher than that. So electricity is important for productive uses, not just for residential consumption. And we quote some work which I think from a really exciting, or really does some work, hub, and the Energy for Growth Hub, which is based in the US, and I think does some really interesting, exciting work in this space. And they have a concept of the modern energy minimum, which is thinking about energy access to electricity necessary to actually promote sustainable long-term economic growth. And that number is sort of roughly 4 times the number that the UN SDG 7 is framed out in terms of residential things. And that suggests roughly half the world's population doesn't have that modern energy minimum. And sometimes these numbers all just sound very big, and you can just dismiss them, especially when you're sitting where you are or I am in the countries which do have it. But 1 in 2 people, right, on the planet not having access to electricity sufficient to actually generate sustainable growth. 1 in 2 people. And so it just tells you about the magnitude. So I don't wish to be sort of pessimistic. I'm always trying to be very optimistic on these things, and Meghan played the role of being pessimistic. But it sort of reinforces a challenge, because not only do we need to bring around this big reduction in carbon emissions each year, we need to do that at the same time as lifting huge parts of the world out of relative energy poverty. And that sort of reinforces this issue. And I think one part of this, and I will stop, I said I only know a few minutes, one is all those things we know about in terms of decarbonizing the energy mix, wind and solar, electrification, hydrogen, CCUS, bioenergy, wind, all of those issues. But the other one, which is really, really important, is energy efficiency. And it's energy efficiency not in India, not in the developed world. It's energy efficiency here in the countries that we are sitting in today. And Meghan quoted the average American will consume 10 or 12 times more energy per capita than the average Indian. And so we're really thinking hard about how to improve energy efficiency in the advanced world to free up those energy resources and free up, if you like, those carbon emissions, so allow growth in the emerging markets.
Laura, yeah, I'd love to hear your comment on that. And one of the things that I thought of as I was listening to Spencer, there were so many striking statistics in the Net Zero 2050 report. One of them, I think, is the world is using less total energy in 2050 than it is today to hit a target like that. And that does require fundamentally changing the relationship between GDP growth and population growth and energy use that has existed forever. Maybe you could comment a little bit on what Spencer just said.
Thank you, Jason. I'd like to come back into the access question, which is, I think, very, very fundamental. And what happened last year is not only, as Spencer mentioned, that basically people that were connected to the grid simply became unable to pay their bills, so they could not use the electricity. But at the same time, something equally important happened. We are tracking now electricity access for many, many years, since 2000. And we were very happy to report that since 2013 in Africa, the number of people without access to electricity was actually going down, down, down. Good progress in West Africa, East Africa. We were really reporting some great news. Last year, they stopped. And why was that? Actually, it was a lot of that story was related to the inability of the solar sector to go and deploy. So there were reasons that were related to lockdowns, etc., that really created a halt of working on the deployment of of small solar, but at the same time, and I think that this is the critical part we should be discussing much more, the cost of capital in the emerging markets, and especially in the sub-Saharan African countries where the largest deficit exists today, Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC, etc., it's 3-4 times larger than what we are experiencing in Europe or the US today. What does that do to the energy transition? It makes something that should be when you have a normal cost of solar panels, so the cheapest form of energy that should be in Africa today, solar, it becomes prohibitively expensive. So we were at the Venice Climate Talk at the margin of G20 on finance yesterday, and there was a lot of discussion about carbon pricing. I think a lot of the discussion should actually be moved into the cost of capital. And how do we bring the cost of capital down for the clean energy transition? And how do we bring the cost of capital down for emerging markets? So can we all together think of innovative ways of the development banks, IFIs, of ensuring that there are channels that for clean energy ensure this flow of capital? And Jason mentioned the net zero report and equally the financing report. There is this striking number that says in emerging markets, if we want to reach net zero, we need to multiply by 7 the number of investment that goes into clean energy compared to today, while at the same time, we are facing extremely high cost of capital. And I think this is really where we need to square the circle. I can comment very briefly on the question that Jason asked about decoupling GDP and energy use. I think we underappreciate at times, Spencer, forgive me for saying that, but electrifying the economy brings incredible efficiency gains. NEVs consumes 1/3 of the fuel that a ICE, a conventional car, does. A heat pump consumes 1/4 of what a normal boiler does. And LPG stoves in emerging markets for cook stoves consumes 1/5 of what burning biomass would do. All of this, by definition, moves to a much less energy intensive world, but I go back to the original point, a much more capital intensive one. So how do we make sure that this cost of capital goes down? I would conclude here.
Great. No, really helpful and really important point you just made about, energy inputs and energy services and outputs are not necessarily the same thing depending on what's producing the energy and what electrification would mean. So that was a big part of what the finding was in the net zero report too. Meghan, I want to come back to what you were closed with talking about, which is the need for international cooperation to accelerate the pace of transition. And we also, I think, but I want to hear your comments, need international cooperation to manage and cope with the transition itself, maybe some of the dislocations that might come with it. And so I mentioned earlier, the somewhat unprecedented way in which producers and consumers came together, this huge drop in oil. I think in Spencer, in maybe your speech that was on the BP website around the release, noting what lessons might be learned from the way OPEC and non-OPEC countries came together to try to manage this. Prices went negative in the US at one point. We saw this huge disruption and collapse in oil prices. But as Spencer said, we're going to need to see continued decline in oil year after year. Meghan, when you looked at what happened last year, did it kind of tell you, and of course, in just the last week or two, we've had questions about the continued cooperation of OPEC and rifts now between Saudi and the UAE. But I think Spencer made the point, while you might be able to cooperate for a one-off disruption, that's maybe different from the way producers would respond to an ongoing structural shift where demand is anticipated to decline for many years to come. I'm just wondering if you had thoughts about producers and how they would respond, how they responded last year, and what it tells us about how they may respond going forward if the transition accelerates, as we hope it does.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And I've really enjoyed debating these issues and thinking about them with you over the course of the last year or more. So I would say there are definitely some interesting insights looking at the last year and thinking forward. I was lamenting the paucity of international collaboration, but one of the big exceptions in 2020 was actually collaborations around oil markets. And as you mentioned, it was not just you had OPEC, but you had OPEC plus growing into OPEC plus plus, or whatever we want to refer to it as. And we saw that really unusual step of the United States and then President Trump, not collaborating in a formal fashion, but certainly, becoming a key factor in helping galvanize an outcome between various players within those groupings. So we did see extraordinary and somewhat unprecedented international collaboration to stabilize oil markets during the first part of the pandemic. And then I would say over the course of the rest of the pandemic, up until very recently, I think most people would give OPEC, I'd certainly give OPEC high marks for managing the oil market in a way that I think there were some serious question marks around whether they would all be able to do it. You saw enormous, very high levels of compliance. And so, many people said this demonstrates that OPEC is still relevant. But I think, as you point out, the actual part of transition, and the report, the BP report lays this out as well, the actual act of transition is going to have a lot of different dynamics and different realities, and especially different expectations. And I think that those different expectations about the future are going to put real pressures on the organization and on the individual producers, making it much more difficult to cooperate in the fashion that they have been going forward. And I think simply to be less vague about it, we've seen that the OPEC producers and Saudi and Russia, as a part of OPEC Plus in particular, have been able to constrain production, but they do that with the knowledge that this is a very unusual situation with the pandemic, that we're going to see probably a rapid return to economic growth. And we've already seen a lot of that happen in many parts of the world already. And that demand for oil is going to come back, and that they're going to be able to recoup some of the downside. And we've seen that already. And that is actually what prompted the conversations in OPEC in the last couple of weeks about the need for more oil and rising prices. So, the sense that that was a temporary shock, that the world was going to recover in probably a manageable time period, at least from the perspective of OPEC, really made cooperation possible. I think if we're looking to the energy transition, this long period, we don't know exactly what the curve is, but we're talking about something that is potentially a steadily flattening and downward slope in energy demand, and oil demand in particular, maybe not energy demand, but oil demand. And I think that really creates much different dynamics within OPEC, that there's going to be much less of an incentive to rein in production, to keep prices at a stable place, and that at some point, you're going to have countries deciding that they want to maximize the value of their commodities while there's still some value attached to them. So I think at some point we're likely to see a move away from protecting price towards pursuing market share. And I think in that way, the March-April Russia-Saudi competition of 2020 was a little bit of a window into what that could look like. And that could be, that could happen a lot more rapidly than we think. And just ending on this point about the uncertainty, because no one will be able to declare, yes, we are officially in a systemic decline for oil. So there'll be a lot of uncertainty, and countries might have different reads on when we've hit that point. But once you have a major producer making that assessment, that could tip the other producers into a similar type of moment. So the good performance of last year doesn't make me necessarily convinced that OPEC is going to be able to be as robust going forward.
Really, really interesting. Thanks. We'll need to have a whole another session on recent dynamics between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, because there was a lot going on there, not just in oil markets, but I think probably outside oil markets too. You were going to make one other comment, it looked like, before
no, well, just well, if you have time and you want to come back to this whole, what about the last week and what does that tell us in the Biden administration? I'm happy to do that, but I'm going to give it over to you because I know time is always in short demand.
No, please. I think it's on people's minds, so please go ahead.
Well, just fast forwarding from last year to the past week, and the OPEC story and the oil markets and what does it mean? I think it was a surprise, and some commentators said it's this huge irony that the Biden administration is actually not explicitly calling for more production from OPEC, but calling for them to come to an agreement, which implies more production. And for an administration that is so committed to the energy transition, some people say this is surprising, that we're maybe putting some crimps on production domestically, or that's the expectation, while at the same time encouraging more production overseas. And I would say that, one, yes, the energy transition itself, as you and I have discussed, Jason, is going to have so many of these things that are perceived contradictions, right? So that's going to be the story of this energy transition over the coming years. But two, I would say, if you look a little deeper, I don't find it to be so contradictory, because an energy transition is going to be much more viable and much more manageable in a growing global economy. And high oil prices at this particular moment for the world could be really devastating when you have many countries in the emerging world facing potential debt crises, and you have many countries just struggling to regain positive economic growth in the face of the COVID crisis. So I think, the idea that we don't want to put additional strains of high oil prices on the global economy right now is not inconsistent with an energy transition, which again, I think is easier in an environment where governments actually have resources to promote the energy transition, to make investments in infrastructure, and just look at how much people were thinking first about the return to economic growth and then thinking about environmental sustainability on top of that, maybe at least in the developing world a little bit in that sequence. Just on the point about, what does the Saudi UAE rift tell us about OPEC going forward? I also think it's pretty interesting when you think about OPEC's future. It doesn't mean that OPEC itself is or that these oil producers are not going to matter. It may be the organization of OPEC is less relevant, but certainly some oil producers will matter a lot. As the world consumes less oil, probably more of that oil will be produced by low-cost producers, and Saudi and the UAE will be among them. But we can see that competition that we saw kind of in the OPEC environment is actually indicative of a broader competition. It's a geopolitical competition between Saudi and the UAE, and we could talk about Yemen and all kinds of things, but it's also a competition about the energy transition itself. You have both of those countries trying to be leaders in the renewable energy technologies at the same time as they're trying to, navigate their oil production and their status in the oil market. So I think we are going to see that those countries still matter going forward in the energy transition, but again, that there's going to be this competitive dynamic among them. And this all assumes that OPEC doesn't transform itself in some dramatic way. I think about a much less, existential crisis, but certainly when the Soviet Union collapsed, foreign policy experts were saying NATO is no longer needed. And NATO came up with a new mission, which is, their out of area mission, that NATO operations were going to be mostly required outside of Europe. And NATO reoriented itself to this way. And so the question is, can OPEC find a new mission? And that mission could be helping its members actually manage their economies in a way that foresees, collapse and political turmoil during the energy transition. I don't predict that, but it would be an interesting challenge to put to the organization.
Thank you. Really, really interesting, really rich set of comments. Lots of things to come back to for future events, not even in the next 15 minutes. I want to move beyond geopolitics, but just maybe Spencer, like really quick, one last thing on it, not oil, but natural gas. I think I noted in the stats review, LNG held up pretty well while Russian pipeline gas exports to Europe declined. And I'm wondering, in the same vein as, asking whether OPEC will intervene to prop up prices, does that tell us something about whether Gazprom is sort of intending to act in a similar way? Is that what motivated that?
And yes, and I think the very short punchline summary of the analysis in the review is Gazprom behaved exactly in a similar fashion to OPEC, in the sense that it gave up market share in order to support markets and support prices. But the incentive for them to do that in a short-lived temporary demand shock like we saw last year is very different to one where if we see a sustained fall in sort of gas imports, particularly this was a story into Europe where Gazprom gave up their market share. If we see a sustained shift in Europe away from fossil fuels, reducing its demand for gas imports, the incentive at that point for Russian pipeline exporters to cede market share and stabilize prices is very different, and they may well have a strong incentive to sort of compete to be the last producer standing. So in some sense, entirely parallel set of economic arguments to which Meghan just set out really clearly for OPEC, applied also to the interaction between pipeline exporters and LNG competing, getting that gas on gas competition within European markets last year.
Thank you. You noted the equivalent implied carbon price of $1,400 a ton. There was a couple of questions from the audience on that, including how that number was derived. I take it was kind of looking at emissions decline and GDP decline. But tell me if I have that right. And then James, I'd love if you could comment on that number, and as someone who models the energy transition, what it tells you, if anything, about the policy outlook and how to think maybe about the costs of well-managed versus disorderly transitions, because obviously that could directly impact public support for the kind of pace of transition we're going to need, declines like this each and every year moving forward. So go ahead, James. I think unless Spencer wanted to correct me in how that number was derived. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, and again, following up on Lara's comment about, we energy systems modelers always focus too much on carbon prices. It'd be interesting to know other options other than just carbon prices as tools to accelerate the transition. But yeah, I saw this number that Spencer mentioned, this $1,400 per ton of CO2 as an equivalent carbon price. And so when we think about carbon prices in energy systems models, they're normally, for a net zero policy target, they're starting at around $100 a ton in 2025, and for these net zero policy pathways. I think for Lara's net zero 2050, it was $75 a ton in 2025 and grows thereafter. But of course, these carbon prices assume that we're doing things in an orderly fashion. You start investing in the low-hanging fruit. So you invest in energy efficiency, you invest in the power sector first, because that's where the low-hanging fruit is. You invest in efficiency in buildings, and then you start to tackle transport and you tackle industry, the really kind of hard to decarbonize sectors later on. Whereas as a result of COVID, it was demand that was destroyed in transport, and then all the economic inefficiencies as a result of that. So there've been certain commentators saying, yeah, we need to continue these rates of decarbonization at 6.3, 6.5% per year. And so it's going to be just continued rates of decarbonization similar to COVID. But of course, anybody in the community or in the industry knows that it's not a carbon price of $1,400 a ton. That's the most inefficient possible way of doing it. You're flipping things, starting things in reverse order. You're reducing economic productivity using capital stocks at 60, 50%. The refinery capacity, I think Spencer talked about, in some countries was dropping below 70%. So it's just really inefficient way of estimating decarbonization. So I wouldn't say that is an accurate assessment of the types of carbon prices we need to make, but it does show the difficulty that we need to the difficulty that we face. So the last thing I'll say is that, of course, this is the carbon price that we'd see doing things inefficiently in a disordered way, destroying demand and doing things in a disorderly way, which would hopefully motivate increasing ambition and planning and decarbonizing in an orderly way and in an ambitious way, so that other shocks don't come down the line like extreme climate events that we've seen in Texas or seeing in Northern Canada right now that could have similar disorderly impacts on demand and on infrastructure.
And just Jason, just to emphasize, so in terms of the mechanics here, this is ridiculous, embarrassingly simple. We just compared the fall in GDP with the fall in carbon to get an implied price, with the logic being that the fall in energy demand was to a very, very large extent driven by the fall in GDP. That was what one drove the other. And as James was saying, the point here wasn't to say, so wow, you need a carbon price of $1,400 a ton, not whatsoever. And our profile for carbon prices in BP's net zero scenario was very, very similar to the profile for carbon prices in the IEA net emissions scenario. This was rather, the point was saying, this is not the way to do it. That's the point of this thing, was it's not the way to do it, because by doing it by just stopping GDP activity, and not only did it have huge impact on people's lives, it was just a very inefficient way of reducing carbon emissions. So we need to find more efficient ways of doing it. And the $1,400 a ton was just a way of highlighting how inefficient that was. So it wasn't in any way a suggestion that's what's needed. It was more a sort of very simple summary statistic to show that that's not the right way of doing it.
Yeah, and I understand why you would attribute it to largely the shutdown in the economy. I do, it's always interesting to look every year at the statistical review for many things, including whether we're starting to see energy intensity of GDP and carbon intensity of GDP break apart, as I think we're going to need to see. I think the stats review finds about 2/3 of the drop in emissions due to the decline in energy use, about 1/3 to a reduction in CO2 intensity of energy, but I take it that's more a function of a smaller denominator than it is some fundamental change in the energy mix.
It's both due to oil. So what happens is, oil is, you saw a disproportionately large fall in oil. Oil is relatively carbon intensive, and so that took down the carbon intensity as well. So if you think about, if I disaggregate, which I did, and disaggregated the fall in carbon intensity and said, well, what caused that fall in carbon intensity? Around 2/3 of it was due to what happened to oil. So this was an oil story. So it's an oil story in terms of demand and an oil story in terms of intensity.
Yeah.
And yeah.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to pull in one or two other questions. There's one from another of our research scholars here and a board member, Marianne Ka, who I think several of you know, Spencer, who I think her question broadly relates to what things you saw last year that may stick, that may actually be ongoing and persistent changes. So she asks, to what extent, if any, did we see movement from major cities to suburbs and smaller cities? Is the trend likely to reverse post-COVID? There was also a sharp fall off in mass transit use in 2020 and the rise of personal vehicles. Are these cyclical? Are they structural? Are we all, this is one of the first events like this I've done from our office. I've been doing them from home for a long time. Are people going to follow suit, or are we mostly going to be not changing our behavior? What's going to persist that will have an impact?
And so I think it appears that working from home will. How big an impact that will have on oil demand really varies, and there's some really nice detailed work from the IEA on that. I guess one point I would highlight, which is in the spirit of that, and it picks up a point that Laura made earlier, is we did see very strong growth in electric vehicles last year. But then when you say, well, where was that? That was very, very largely in the EU. Okay, so you didn't see strong growth in China, didn't see very strong growth in the US. It was very strong growth in the EU. What was driving that? It was because the nature of the vehicle emissions directives in the EU was last year was when there was a real bite in terms of those EU vehicle emissions directives. And that's what caused this very strong growth in both pure battery electric vehicles and also hybrid vehicles, where the combined sales of electric cars, if you put those two together in the EU last year, was quite close to that of China, where if you go to 2019, China was the biggest growth market by 40% or something. So the reason why I think this is interesting is when we think about the prospects for electric vehicles penetrating rapidly, the analysis that we have in BP, which has a really quite strong growth is very much a sort of regulatory driven model over the next 5 or 10 years, that those vehicle emission directives really bite, like equivalent to your cafe in America. They really bite, and they can have a big impact in terms of really accelerating the pickup of the penetration of electric cars. And if what we saw last year is it worked, it was in practice in the EU, and it was huge. And so I think sometimes when I come to the US, in particular in the US, I get some criticism that, well, these types of regulations don't really bite. Well, they did and they did in real time in the EU in the EU last year. And that had a big impact on that trend that Laura highlighted at the beginning in terms of electric cars still growing. So I think that's one thing, and I think I find that an encouraging sign for the future. That we've got a sort of real world example that sort of one of those policy levers was pulled and was successful.
Yeah, I'd be maybe just in our final seconds, Laura and James, interested, in any comment or reaction you had to that. You spend so much time doing energy modeling. As you think about how you do that work, what changes will persist? What do you think differently about assumptions on behavior, on technology, on cost, on policy that you think differently about today because of what we went through in 2020?
Thank you, Jason. 1 minute only. So I fully agree with Spencer. EVs, I think, are here to stay. I think partly the reason is certainly the one that Spencer mentioned, this 10%. We're seeing first quarter of this year, 10% sales in Europe where actually electric vehicles is a huge, huge number. However, I think that there is a real fundamental change from the automotive industry that is happening at the same time, which will change supply. And this will dent even in places where regulation is not there. 18 out of the 20 largest manufacturers, 80% of the global car manufacturers have now electric vehicles models there. We have actually doubled the number of electric vehicle models on sale over the past year alone. So I think this is really a trend that we have locked in. On the behavior side, I think we are here to watch what's going to happen. And we have done some analysis, and I am pretty shocked by the little amount of emissions that is actually saved. Even if you work permanently, all of us from home 1 day a week, we are talking about some hundreds of millions of tons. And here, our global challenge is tens of gigatons. So we are orders of magnitude away. Thank you.
Thank you. Final, very quick comment in our last 30 seconds, James.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to add anything more than Laura on that. I think we can learn a lot from the energy systems modeling from Laura. One thing that I'm interested to understand is some of the modal shifts and behavioral shifts that have happened during COVID. So, the cities getting away from public transport, cities like Paris, where Laura is, adopting bikes in a way that was never seen previously, and the impact on that. That's something that we'll certainly look at in our models in CGEP, but looking at that next year.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Spencer, thanks for making this data available, for pulling it together, you and your whole team. I see Michael Cohen joining us here on the Zoom, so thanks to all of you. Always appreciate the perspective you bring to this discussion, especially after such an extraordinary and difficult year in 2020. Laura, James, Meghan, really fantastic insights. Thanks for making so much time to be with us for this discussion of the statistical review last year. Again, this event has been recorded. It'll go up on our website in a few days. You'll find a list of upcoming events in the chat. Please join us for them. Thank you again to all of you. Have a good day.
Cool. Thank you, Jason. Thank you.